This is Boomer Life on CL 650.
And welcome to The Law Show on CL 650. We're speaking from Kevin Hyde, partner at McQuarrie LLP, and Neil Mulholland, associate counsel. And we're talking about more complex cases that you deal with for accident victims and their families. This is the personal injury side of McQuarrie LLP. So, Neil, when you're going into a file and you see that it's more complex, you've mentioned you've had some cases go as long as 13 years. You know you're in it for the long haul. The firm is investing in getting all the specialty assessments. These amounts can get big, right? So can you give me some examples of a case that you've had and what was involved and what the end result was?
When we talk about something that's a catastrophic loss, we use the word catastrophic because of the impact that it has on the individual, the impact it has on the client. And so that would include a loss where somebody has lost their ability to move. Somebody who may end up in a wheelchair, for example.
Sure.
Somebody who's lost their ability to earn an income, either at the same level they were at before or altogether.
And we had Nate on before. We talked about the whole person, trying to make the person whole again. Well, you can't make them whole when it comes to their ability. They might, as you mentioned, be in a wheelchair or to make an income, but that's where the settlement comes in. They're trying to backstop it with money, I guess. Money
is the only thing the system has to give someone.
Right. And you can't give them back their health or anything else.
It would be nice if we could.
Yeah.
But the reality is quite simply that we have to simply reduce the various losses that someone has suffered into dollars and cents. And that's fairly straightforward when it comes to lost income or out-of-pocket medical costs and that sort of thing. It's much more challenging when it comes to assessing pain and suffering. And so what the law looks to do is it looks to assess what does the pain and suffering do to someone's lifestyle. So, for example, if a lady used to play tennis every weekend from May through October avidly, and her social life was centered around
the tennis club and all that
stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then she gets in an accident, and one of the impacts is that she's no longer able to do that at all. Well, she's lost the enjoyment of playing tennis. She's probably going to end up losing some of the social connections that come with that activity. She's likely going to lose some of the health and fitness benefits that come with that activity. And that's just for starters.
Yeah.
And then imagine this goes on for 2.5 years. So by the time that we get to the point where the person may be getting to a substantial recovery or hopefully full recovery, they may have been out of that activity for 3 seasons. And then you ask yourself, well, what's that worth to you? And of course, there's no way you can measure that in any kind of objective way. There's no formula you can sort of plug in certain units of pain equals a certain number of dollars. What we have is a system that we've been evolving for centuries. It goes back to Anglo-Saxon times where we compensate loss of enjoyment with money. And the system is kind of anchored by a set of Supreme Court of Canada decisions that came out in the late 1970s that put a ceiling on damages for pain and suffering and loss of enjoyment of life.
Why was that?
Well, before that, there was really not much of a framework to that. You sort of had to guess at what kind of dollars would make someone's life more palatable, depending whether they had a 2-year whiplash injury or whether they had a loss of mobility or a severe brain injury, for example. And in order to kind of bring some sense to that, the Supreme Court of Canada said, okay, as of 1978, I believe it was, the upper limit on those damages is $100,000.
Has that been upgraded over the years?
Yes, it's floated up with inflation. So I think it's currently believed to be in the 360 to 370 range. And of course, that would tend to be re-examined anytime a catastrophic case ends up in trial. And that is the level of damages awarded for the pain and suffering category to somebody who has the worst injury you can imagine.
It doesn't seem like a lot to
It
me.
isn't.
Yeah.
So when you hear about somebody getting, say, a $2.4 million award on a motor vehicle accident claim, the vast majority of that award is for past income loss and future loss of earning capacity or loss of income in the future.
And we have a very different system than they do in the United States, right? Don't they offer more for pain and suffering there?
It depends on the state.
Yeah.
And
because we hear a lot of politicians going after personal injury lawyers in the U.S. because of these massive settlements.
And you have a very different assessment system in most U.S. states than we do here, in that most of those gargantuan damage assessments you hear about come out of jury trials.
Right.
And in British Columbia, at least, the use of jury trials in civil cases is much more limited than it is in most U.S. jurisdictions. And it's not hard to see where those kinds of damages come from. A very sympathetic and often very tragic set of facts is put before a jury who have, for the most part, no previous connection to the legal system or the insurance industry or anything of that nature. And they see the horrible impacts on this person's life. They immediately identify their own situation with that.
Empathy, right?
Exactly. What would it take for me to feel better in this circumstance? And they, in many cases, tend to presume that insurance companies have limitless deep pockets and they can make these huge awards with no impacts.
So do you think that $360,000 or $70,000 is fair? It's what we have to work with.
It's what we have to work with. Is it fair? Well, I mean, what level of money is fair when someone has lost their ability to even get out of bed? You know?
And going back to what Neil was saying before with regards to the loss of enjoyment of life, that just shows how important, and also the amount of time often some of these claims take, it shows how important it is to choose the right lawyer and to feel comfortable with that lawyer, because what they're doing is they have to be able to properly advocate on your behalf what your life looked like before the accident and what your life looks like after the accident.
So going back to the tennis analogy, somebody might look at that as frivolous. Well, you don't get to play tennis anymore, whatever, it's just tennis, right? But somebody not being able to walk is much more serious.
But when you look at the ramifications of somebody's loss of, say, their main recreational activity, and you start to think about that and you start to
extrapolate that out, right?
Exactly. You begin to see the impacts. And they can be insidious. They can be somewhat more subtle.
I guess you could suffer from depression because you're not getting exercise.
Weight gain, depression, fatigue. Yeah. It changes your life, your irritability. Often you meet with their preparing for trial. You meet with their friends and family, and they tell you that this person, due to these soft tissue injuries, and can no longer play tennis or work out at the gym or do what they used to do beforehand, has completely changed as a result of it.
And oftentimes that can result in things like lost relationships. It can result in things like missed promotions.
Yeah, because you're moody now, you're not feeling yourself. So back to some of the examples. So you're saying the bulk of the settlement often is the loss of income.
Right.
And so it varies much differently from somebody who's working in a restaurant as a dishwasher versus someone who's a highly skilled professional like yourself or a doctor or an architect or somebody like that, much bigger amounts.
And it varies, of course, depending on the person's age and the point at which they're at in their career development. One of the more challenging kinds of cases, for example, is when you're dealing with somebody whose career is still kind of in its infancy. Somebody who may be, in some cases, still a student or still going through some kind of apprenticeship program.
So they're going through maybe to become a lawyer like yourself. So what is the upward amount of money they could make?
There could be, for example, a student who's an A student in high school, grade 10, for example, that suffers a head injury, a brain injury as a result of an accident. And everything was pointing that that person wanted to become a doctor or a surgeon. And because of this head injury, their grades drop significantly. They don't get into university, and their future takes a completely different course of what it was the day before the accident.
So how do you argue that on their behalf?
Well, it's a game of probabilities. What is the chance this person would have been able to successfully gain admission to medical school, would have completed the program, gone on to practice as a surgeon? And we can look at sort of labor market statistics to give us some guidance to that. For example, we know that for every place in medical school, there's a certain number of applicants, that the cutoff in terms of the required marks to get in is typically at a certain level. And we can say, well, before the accident, you were on track to reach that cutoff. Now you really have no realistic hope of getting there. And then you're applying those probabilities throughout that entire analysis, saying what is the likelihood they would have finished med school? what's the likelihood they would have practiced medicine and been successful at it? And you would look at figures like, well, what is the failure rate, for example, at the med school they may have been intending to attend. And
it's really kind of unfair, isn't it? That it's a bit cruel because they might have been that 5% that actually does it. And there's no way to know that.
But you got to think of it this way, too. Let's say somebody is 16 years old and is a fairly talented hockey player. Mm-hmm. And plays rep hockey at a very high level and so on and so forth. And some people believe that that individual might just have the talent to eventually have a professional hockey career. But realistically, we know that there are tens of thousands of kids with the same level of talent.
Absolutely, yeah.
And a small percentage of them will actually make it.
Yeah.
You can get evidence from experts, scouts, coaches, development professionals and so forth, who can talk about the particular skill set that this individual had and the likelihood that they would have made it. But again, it's all a game of percentages. Mm-hmm. And typically what ends up happening is if you can prove to a court that your client had a 50% shot at making it in the NHL, and they have, say, a 5-year career at a more or less moderate level of salary, there are cases where the courts have awarded something along those lines. But it's very, very difficult to prove. Mm-hmm. And in practice, it's only going to be the exceptional case where that's even going to fly. Mm-hmm. But the principles behind that are not really any different from the principles behind the medical student example we just talked about.
Yeah.
In other words, there was a likelihood that this person would not have gotten into medical school and would have ended up doing something far less lucrative, perhaps. But all we can do is measure it based on what was out there before the accident, what parts they were producing, for example.
On the other hand, you could say, well, is every 16-year-old that's in an accident was going to be a surgeon?
Yeah.
It's easy to say that, but they might have wanted to do something totally different.
Exactly.
So that's the check and balance you have in the court system.
Yeah, and the court does its best to try and sort of balance the desire to be fair to a plaintiff who clearly has had some of their life's dreams shattered.
Away, yeah.
On the one hand, and not giving people a windfall that would never likely have occurred to them but for the accident on the other.
When we come back, we're going to find out what is a functional capacity evaluation. Am I saying it right?
You are.
We're going to find out what that is next on The Law Show on CL 650.
Canada's only weekly radio show dedicated to the baby boomer lifestyle. This is Boomer Life on CL 650.